Today, we're going to dive into the terrifying power of fear itself. We're going to look at a really dark chapter from World War II to understand how propaganda can get so powerful that it actually leads people to make the most tragic choice imaginable.
So, to really get this, we have to start with an incredibly shocking event. It's an event that really sets the stage for everything else we're about to uncover, a literal leap into fear.
I want you to try and picture this scene. It's 1944, the island of Saipan. The battle is over, it's lost. But instead of surrender, something absolutely horrifying happens. You have entire Japanese civilian families, we're talking men, women, and even children, walking to the edge of these high, jagged cliffs and just stepping off, plunging to their deaths on the rocks and the sea below. So you have to ask yourself, right, what could possibly compel people to do this, to make a choice that devastating? Why on earth was death a better option than surrendering to the American forces who were right there? Well, the answer, it lies in a very carefully constructed psychological nightmare. Okay, so to really unpack how this happened, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to look at the enemy that Japan expected to fight in the first place. You know, in the early days of the war, there was this incredible sense of confidence, maybe even arrogance, inside the Japanese military leadership. The common thinking was that Americans were just soft, a decadent, comfortable people. They saw them as hopelessly individualistic, not devoted to a collective cause, and figured they would just fold at the first sign of any real trouble. They completely, fundamentally underestimated their opponent. Well, that initial belief, it was about to get absolutely shattered by a reality that was, frankly, more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And man, the psychological shock of this new reality was just immense. The soft nation they were expecting turned out to be an industrial juggernaut. Just try to imagine it. For every single ship Japan managed to sink, it felt like America launched 10 more. For every plane they shot down, a dozen more seemed to appear on the horizon. It was this relentless, crushing tide of war material that seemed totally impossible to stop. So if you're a Japanese soldier or even just a civilian hearing these stories, seeing this is deeply, deeply demoralizing. This wasn't a battle against men anymore. It felt like a battle against factories, against an entire economy that could just replace its losses forever. And that reality, it planted the very first seeds of a new existential kind of terror. So what do you do when you're faced with that kind of growing hopelessness? Well, the imperial propaganda machine kicks into overdrive. The thinking was, if they couldn't beat the enemy with machines, they would steal their own people's resolve by turning that enemy into an inhuman monster. Okay, so step one was to basically criminalize the enemy. Propaganda starts circulating that the U.S. Marines weren't really soldiers in the way we think of them. No, they were convicts, violent criminals, just unleashed from prisons and sent straight to the Pacific. This paints a picture not of an honorable opponent, but of society's absolute worst, sent to do violence. And then the stories just escalate. They get even more sinister. The propaganda started claiming that these weren't just criminals. They were bloodthirsty sadists who actually enjoyed torture and this is the most terrifying part, the slaughter of entire families. I mean, that's a direct attack on the deepest fear any civilian has, the safety of their kids, their loved ones. And then you get the final step, where the propaganda just strips away any last shred of humanity. The Americans weren't men anymore, not even evil men. They were portrayed as literal demons, supernatural monsters with claws and fangs, coming to inflict horrors you can't even imagine. And when you believe a literal demon is coming for you, surrender is no longer an option. And this is where the story takes its most tragic turn. This is the moment where the horrific fiction of the propaganda seemed to be confirmed by a really grim, partial truth. Now, we have to be clear here. It is a documented fact that some American troops in the Pacific engaged in the absolutely horrific practice of trophy taking. And yes, sometimes this included collecting the skulls and teeth of Japanese soldiers. Now, objectively, it was a brutal act in a brutally violent war. But I want you to try and put yourself in the shoes of a terrified Japanese civilian who's been fed all these stories about demons and monsters. For them, this was everything. It was the physical proof. The monster stories felt real. So you take all of these pieces, the overwhelming industrial might, the manufactured monster, and this grim, terrible proof, and you put them all together. What you get is a perfect psychological trap. And that trap had a terrible final price. Look, dehumanizing the enemy is a classic tool of war. It's meant to make your soldiers fight harder without hesitation. But what we see here is how it can become this catastrophic, double-edged sword. Sure, it might have fueled the fighting spirit of some soldiers, but for the civilians who were trapped, it completely eliminated any hope of survival after surrender.
And that right there, that takes us all the way back to those cliffs on Saipan. For those families standing on the edge, the choice was between two different fears: the certain, swift fear of falling and the imagined, unbearable fear of what these demons would do to them and their children if they were captured. The propaganda had done its job so well that the monster had become more real, more terrifying than death itself. This whole history is just a chilling reminder that words and images, they can create a reality all on their own. And it forces us to ask a really critical question. When we see the enemy portrayed in conflicts today, are we really seeing a person, or are we being shown a monster?